In about a minute or two. Just let some last minute folks join us. And Carrie, I think that'll probably happen a little bit throughout. So keep an eye on that. Good. Record and get us started. Thanks.
Welcome everybody to the quarterly Human Trafficking Prevention Project webinar. This is a series hosted by the HTPP, the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, as a part of the MVLS Third Thursday events. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Carrie Lee. I'm with the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. I'm also with my supervisor, Jess Emerson, who is the director of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. The Human Trafficking Prevention Project, or the HTPP, focuses on reducing the collateral consequences of criminal legal involvement of sex workers, survivors of human trafficking, and those populations put at higher risk of exploitation. We also partnership with the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Services, or MVLS, which is the Maryland's largest provider of pro bono legal services, to further assist or better assist our clients. Today we will be discussing how improper use of the trafficking narrative can endanger survivors and increase trafficking risk. And I'm super excited about our panelists that we have here with us today. First, we have CP Hoffman. They is a non-binary advocate dedicated to advancing the rights of marginalized communities, including transgender communities, the broader LGBTQIA+ community, and communities of color, and exploring the intersections of law, social justice, gender, and culture. CP has served as Senior Policy Counsel at the National Center for Transgender Equality, Legal Director and Policy Director of Free State Justice, Maryland's statewide LGBTQIA+ advocacy organization, worked in-house advising the nation's leading digital accessibility services firm on trends in accessibility litigation, practiced antitrust law in New York City, and published broadly on a number of subjects, including law and social justice, gender, and popular culture, as well as intersections of all three.
So she does nothing.
Yeah, basically, she's never done anything.
of value, anyways.
We also have with us Lauren Salzman. Lauren recently joined IUDA's DC office as a supervising immigration attorney, where she represents low-income immigrants in a variety of matters, including newly arrived immigrants and survivors of human trafficking, intimate partner violence, and other crimes. Prior to her work at IUDA, Lauren was a supervising attorney at Legal Aid Chicago, where she represented agricultural workers in matters related to working and living conditions, occupational health and safety, and human trafficking. We also have with us Melanie Shapiro. Melanie currently works as the Public Policy Director at Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence before joining MNADV, which is a mouthful.
Hashtag all the acronyms.
Yes. Melanie worked in various roles, including as a member, Melanie worked for the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, where she worked in various roles, including as a member of the Government Relations Division. Government Relations Team, my apologies, Melanie, and the former chief attorney for the Baltimore City Juvenile Division. Prior to joining the MOPD, Ms. Shapiro represented children in child protective and juvenile delinquency proceedings at the Legal Aid Society's Juvenile Rights Division in New York City. We also have Jess Emerson. I'll let her do a little bit more to introduce herself, but she, as I said before, is the director of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. Before I turn it over to the panelists, just a few housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar, so if you have to jump off early, you can watch it later. There is closed captioning available for those who need it. It's on the bar. You can activate it as needed. We will be utilizing the question and answer feature and not chat. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A icon down at the bottom of your screen. And when at the end of each section the panelists handles, they will be answering some of those questions. Additionally, this webinar will be available on our website, the htprevention.org, as well as MVLS after the webinar. So now I'm going to turn the time over to Jess Emerson and Melanie Shapiro.
Great. Good afternoon. Good 12:06. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jessica Emerson. My pronouns are she, her, and I direct the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. I'm not going to really give a bio. My bio's on the website if you want to read about it. Want to say thank you first to the panelists for agreeing to navigate this rather fraught topic with us, as well as the participants. The last time I looked, we had over 70 people listening in. Carrie is working on admitting the rest. And I really hope that this is kind of the start of a discussion that I think is long overdue. The reality is that a lot of our webinars, we do these webinars quarterly. We've been doing them, I think, since 2020. A lot of our webinars come out of the legitimate need to kind of want to make connections that are important. Like we first started with talking about like the link between human trafficking and interpersonal violence, the link between trafficking and, housing discrimination. But we've moved into a segment that we're focused more on trafficking and survivor resilience, including those things that either increase or lessen people's vulnerability to trafficking. And increase is kind of where this came about. The idea for this webinar honestly just stemmed from stuff that we were all seeing. I see Melanie nodding because I think she was one of the first people that I talked to about this. Just things that we were seeing in our policy work or our systemic change work that were bothering us, for lack of a better way to put it, and that weren't jiving with the goals that, at least as far as the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, the goals that we set in supporting systemic change that lessens people's vulnerability to trafficking rather than increasing it. So before we go into that, I do want to just give us a little bit of information to kind of frame things, and I'm going to bring Melanie into this as well. Because I think that we need to kind of have this framework to have this discussion, but should only take about 5 minutes. Essentially, I want to talk about the history of misinformation and bias, quite frankly, within the anti-trafficking movement. As those of you who have done anti-trafficking work before know, the first kind of legal framework, at least in the US, that focused on trafficking is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And that was passed in 2000, but the framework to that, the protection, prosecution, and prevention arms of kind of the way that the TVPA was structured were developed in the years prior. The TVPA's primary focus was on foreign nationals. That has changed as we have kind of obviously recognized that people who were born in the United States are trafficked as well. That's kind of how I got into the work. I was a social worker for a decade and worked with adolescent survivors who, 99% of the time were born right in New York City where I was doing the work. And that's all well and good. But prior to that, the way that kind of the anti-trafficking movement was built, it was steeped in a lot of race-based assumptions and flat-out racism. So that the history of the modern anti-trafficking movement really has prioritized white victims over victims of color. Some of the earliest anti-trafficking organizations wouldn't actually even work with victims of color, and has prioritized sex trafficking over labor trafficking, even though that we know that labor trafficking happens far more frequently. And as well as the villainization of Black and brown men as the primary perpetrators of trafficking. So, as this or awareness of this truly horrible crime or horrific crime has grown, the flood of money into the issue has grown in terms of money that is rightfully available for a lot of the people on the screen to do the work that we do. But because of that, that has influenced a lot of people doing or seeking to do the work to prioritize or to highlight, the most sensational or media-friendly cases, as well as to perpetuate, the easier, at least, to understand myth of the innocent victim, the evil offender, and the good rescuer. Now, we could have a webinar all on that, and maybe we will. But just to kind of frame that, that kind of understanding trafficking as involving, an innocent victim, an evil perpetrator, and a good rescuer, that is a very easy way to kind of understand what is happening. And it's a lot easier to give money to organizations that kind of prioritize that viewpoint. Additionally, the movement and I would say the country's comfort with the villainization of Black and brown men has meant that has kind of led us to prioritize the narrative around quote unquote pimp and gang controlled trafficking that's perpetrated by Black and brown men. And what all of this has kind of resulted in is policies and kind of ways of doing the work that ignore both the complexity and the broad spectrum of trafficking, as well as the root causes of exploitation, like poverty, like discrimination, like histories of interpersonal violence and child sexual abuse and housing instability. Because if you have that innocent victim, the evil offender, and the good rescuer, it's very easy to just take the evil offender out of the equation, provide services to the good and innocent victim and move on with your lives. It's kind of a very one-dimensional view. Now, I don't want to say all of this to say that, the majority of people that are doing this work are doing it with poor intentions. That's simply not the case. People do actually care about trafficking, and they should care about trafficking. And in the work that we do, it's really been helpful in framing certain issues. So for instance, like our trafficking prevention work, the HTPP focuses on systemic change, like I said, that we can use trafficking as a helpful way to show that issues like economic security and access to criminal record relief actually create more choices for folks. And that makes them less vulnerable to trafficking. But what this also, this history and this kind of one-dimensional understanding of things also means that folks who are either well-meaning but, less informed about the complexity of the issue, or folks who are simply willing to unfortunately exploit the good intentions of others for less well-intentioned ends, have begun using trafficking as the impetus to pass measures and support policies that actually put people at higher risk of trafficking. And that's really what we want to focus on today. So for those of you who may have attended the Maryland Human Trafficking Professionals Conference last month in Ocean City, it's similar or related to the information that Melanie and I presented, and Renee Battle Brooks, former Prince George's County human trafficking prosecutor, now the head of the Civil Rights Division in Prince George's County. We presented on the unintended consequences of anti-trafficking legislation, where essentially well-intentioned legislation that's designed to address the very real harms of trafficking actually results in harm to other marginalized populations. And in this case, we're kind of narrowing things even further to say that we're talking about legislation or policies that can actually result in more trafficking, even though preventing trafficking is what's being used to support the policy. So we were focused kind of on, policies that, were focused on on human trafficking, but harmed people engaging in survival or consensual sex work. We're talking about kind of more direct, actually putting people at higher risk of trafficking, even though we're saying that we want people to not be trafficked. So Melanie, when we spoke about this panel, kind of in preparation for this, you highlighted that you've seen some similar parallels in your policy work on behalf of MNADV, hashtag all the acronyms. Can you tell us a little bit about that before we discuss some specific examples of the exploitation of the trafficking narrative?
Absolutely, Jess. Thank you so much for having me. So as Jess indicated, most of the legislation that does come in is well-intentioned, but then there are others that are, in fact, while the intentions might be good, the reality is that they can be very harmful, and in this case, unfortunately, lethal. So what we hear a lot in the firearm context is that we need to ensure that victims and survivors of domestic violence can have access to firearms. And the reality is that it doesn't matter whose gun it is in a domestic violence situation. The presence of anyone's firearm increases the risk of lethality by up to 500%. And there's been research that has supported this, but what we'll often hear in different contexts when talking about legislation, that this is going to make it harder for a victim to get a gun. And they need the gun to protect themselves. So there is the National Crime Victimization Survey that is done, and it sort of provides data points and sample sizes. And in one of the reports, women who were victims of attempted or completed crimes use guns to defend themselves 0.4% of the time, according to this survey. So it just, the data does not support the argument that if somebody has a firearm, they're going to be able to defend themselves in a domestic violence situation. And in fact, there was an awful example in the District of Columbia just a couple of months ago. And I'm going to read to you what was reported in the Washington Post. This person has been arrested and charged, is innocent until proven guilty, but talks about the history of domestic violence, and there had just been a protective order that had been granted. It had not yet been served. But in the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, police said this individual returned to the home and used his key to get inside. He told police that during an argument, the victim headed to a closet where he claimed she kept a firearm, according to the arrest affidavit. He told police that he reached the closet first, grabbed the gun, and shot her on a second floor landing, according to the affidavit. So he used her gun to kill her. And so the argument that we need to be arming victims is potentially lethal, because just the presence of the firearm increases the risk of lethality. And so there are a lot of parallels. One, there's the intersection of trafficking and intimate partner violence, and also the intersection with trafficking and firearms and domestic violence and firearms. And so this really just serves to illustrate the dangers and the harms that can be caused. And it's very easy when you're in sort of a legislative session or a discussion or an argument around a particular piece of legislation, when you're trying to win your point, make your point, get something passed, or make sure it doesn't pass, to use victims to prove your point. And so it's incredibly important that we go back to the efficacy, to the data, to see, is this really something that is true? To go to the experts on the issue and validate that what is being argued is in fact accurate. Because if it's not, the harms, as we'll discuss by the other panelists, are incredibly harmful and can be very dangerous.
Yeah. So what you're highlighting essentially is that legislation that, is being said to protect victims is actually putting them from harm, interpersonal violence, domestic violence, is actually putting them at greater risk for interpersonal violence.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. Well, and not just the interpersonal violence, but it increases the risk of lethality. The domestic violence, the action's going to occur potentially regardless. But if there's that firearm, if we're buying the argument that a victim needs to be arming themselves instead of utilizing some of the other systems that are in place, the statistics again and again and again show that the firearm doesn't assist in any type of self-defense, and in fact, more often is used against the victim themselves.
And I'm also thinking about the bill, and we don't have to go into this, but just another example is the bill from this last session that was designed, that the hope was to decriminalize, the presence of domestic violence in front of a child, right?
The child abuse.
Yeah. So saying that failure to protect your child from witnessing domestic violence is a crime. And those of us and that is a crime right now in Maryland. And the effort was to decriminalize that. And I remember those of us who went in and testified in support of that, many of whom, quite honestly, had testified for that law before, had said that criminalizing people actually puts them at greater risk of interpersonal violence because they're not allowed to leave. They're scared to report. They become homeless. They have a criminal record and they can't get housing, and all of these things that we know drive people into the arms of those who don't have our best intentions at heart.
Correct. And the response to that, by taking a child from a parent who is in an intimate partner violent situation, who may not have the resources to leave,
right,
we are causing further trauma to that child as well as to that parent as well. And similar to trafficking, victims and survivors of domestic violence, it takes multiple times to try and leave that situation. And it's a complicated situation, right? We don't want children exposed to domestic violence, but at the same time, using the child welfare system and using the criminal legal system in either circumstance is only going to create more harms, especially if a parent themselves is a victim of violence.
Great, thank you. So that's kind of, our frame. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to throw out the thought that occurred to me, which is just how old this rhetoric is. Like you were talking, Jess, about how, we've been seeing it for a few decades now. But honestly, if we go back, we see the exact same sorts of arguments being raised in like the late 19th, early 20th century. They didn't necessarily call it trafficking at that point, but it's actually really indicative of the racism around it, because the way that it was often framed at that point was white slavery.
Yes, that was the White Slavery Act.
Yeah, and so you have like things like the Comstock Act and the White Slavery Act, like designed to, try to protect the purity of white women, but created situations that it actually made them more difficult to leave hostile situations, escape from situations where they were being trafficked, etc. So, like the Comstock Act, which has gotten actually more discussion in the past few months than it has in quite a while. But it's like its restriction on sharing information or, actual paraphernalia around abortion or birth control, etc. It actually made it far more difficult for people to leave hostile situations.
Yeah. So that is the perfect segue into our first topic, which I am going to cover along with Melanie, and then we're going to turn to issues of immigration and also the right of transgender people to simply exist. So the first thing that I want to kind of bring to the attention of our esteemed guests is the exploitation of the trafficking narrative to serve efforts to restrict reproductive rights. Okay, and so the first time that this issue crossed my radar was back in 2019, when former Maryland delegate and former gubernatorial candidate Dan Cox proposed a bill, HB 1152. It was the Interstate Human Trafficking of Minors Prohibition Act. Now, I didn't have any of the thoughts that we're talking about today even in my head, but I knew that this was not okay. And so, essentially, I'm pulling from my testimony and from the bill back in 2019. And essentially, HB 1152 would have done three separate things. It would have required mandated reporters, so not attorneys, but probably a lot of the people on this call, social workers, doctors, nurses, teachers, who encounter a pregnant minor to notify the state's attorney or face a criminal misdemeanor penalty. It would have also barred state monies from being used to fund abortions for minors, just for minors who have been trafficked into Maryland from out of state and who become pregnant as a result of having been trafficked. So let's think about that. Again, it would require any mandated reporter who encountered a pregnant minor to report that to the state's attorney or face criminal charges themselves. And it would also bar the state from providing monies to pay for abortions, but just of minors who have been trafficked into Maryland from out of state. Now, there was also a piece that was actually trafficking related that I thought was very dangerous for other reasons, but it would establish an avenue for felony prosecution of human trafficking in Maryland, even though that already existed. But again, it at least lended some credibility, like this is actually about punishing traffickers. And, again, I didn't know that this would become the blueprint to limit reproductive rights around the country. I did not know this at that point, but I wrote in my testimony, this is a flagrant, the bar the state monies. This will reduce the ability of survivors without financial means to seek abortion care and may force them into the position of having to carry a pregnancy to term against their will. This is a flagrant violation of these survivors' free will and would quite simply amount to state-sponsored reproductive coercion similar to that which they experienced at the hands of their traffickers.
Yeah, Jess, can you do me a favor? Can you read the title of that bill again?
Now
that everybody knows what it's about, read the title again.
The Interstate Human Trafficking of Minors Prohibition Act.
So on its face, you read the title
Sounds
and you're
fabulous.
thinking, wait a second, we don't want minors to be trafficked across state lines. Like that's who wants that? And so I think that just underscores the importance of really taking a deep dive into legislation that it's proposed and looking at it with a careful eye, understanding, and I'll touch on this again at the end, but anybody who knows me knows I always talk about unintended consequences, but really reading things, one, what is this really about? And then two, what are the potential harms that can come of this? And some of them, this particular bill, it's pretty obvious, but if you're just reading the title, you're like,
sounds great.
It's almost like the titles of laws are often like deceptive.
That is genius. So, this was kind of the beginning, but linking trafficking with abortion has become, like I said, kind of a blueprint on behalf of those who are seeking to curb access to reproductive rights in this country. And this past legislative session, HB 808, SB 859, the Reproductive Health Protection Act, which is now passed and been enacted, does the following, and I'm going to use this as another example. It forbids Maryland courts from issuing out-of-state subpoenas or summonses for cases involving legally protected healthcare. It doesn't permit Maryland, or it forbids Maryland to honor a judgment from another state if it arises from a claim related to healthcare that is legally protected here. And it says that the state shall not honor an extradition request, so a request from a state to ship an alleged perpetrator to their state for someone who committed an act in Maryland if it relates to healthcare that is protected here or would not be a crime in Maryland. And this is in reaction to laws like Texas's SB 8, which allows private citizens, so Joe Schmo in Texas can sue someone in another state who assists a Texas citizen in obtaining reproductive health care that is completely legal in the state where they got it. So essentially, I, as someone who works with people who desperately need reproductive health care, if there was a Texas citizen that I assisted in this state with getting an abortion here in Maryland, Joe Schmo could sue me civilly for a lot of money because I helped effectuate an abortion of a Texas citizen, right? And, there was a lot of, kind of, I hate to say this, kind of general opposition to this, but there was also opposition, and I'm quoting this from their written testimony, that abortion shield laws like this, so essentially these are laws that would shield the providers from being sued or criminalized in other states. Abortion shield laws aid sex traffickers. That was actually what kind of the crux of this, the opposition to this bill was, which is essentially that if this bill were passed, sex traffickers would flock to Maryland to get their victims abortions, which they do not want. And that was the reason that we should not pass this. And there was really no evidence for this except for the results of a study that revealed the shocking news that people who engage in forced sexual encounters become pregnant as a result of that experience. And, and as a result of that, they seek access to reproductive health care. Now, they also cited in their testimony, which is something that I agree with because I've seen it with my own eyes, is that coercion played a role sometimes in victims accessing abortion. So folks who did not want to terminate pregnancies, but who were forced to. And that was the reason that the folks who opposed this bill thought that we shouldn't have this shield available. But what we all kind of, or especially me who kind of addressed this in particular, was to say that the solution then, if there is coercive, any kind of coercive healthcare that's taking place, the solution is not to take choice away from those who need it, but instead, because that is essentially the antithesis of, trauma-informed care. Because the fact is that the need for access to comprehensive reproductive services, including abortion care, is essential for survivors of trafficking, given that high-risk sexual activity and sexual violence is so commonly a part of their experience. And there's actually a recent survey that said 7 out of 10 survivors said that they had at least one pregnancy while trafficked, while 1/5 reported 5 or more pregnancies. And there's also studies that indicate, and I think I got this from Melanie, that trafficking survivors are also commonly subjected to reproductive coercion, where an abusive partner tries to control access to the victim's reproductive health or forces sex on them with the intent of getting them pregnant. And so again, the issue with regard to coercive abortions, the solution is to address that coercion, not to take choice away from the individuals who really need it. And the reality is that trafficking survivors without access to reproductive health care, this can mean a pregnancy that tethers them to their traffickers for life.
Jess, if I can just pause you right there, because that I was just about to say, and the unintended consequence is,
Right.
because that is the unintended consequence. And so while they're framing it as people are going to be trafficked into your state because you're going to allow reproductive choice,
Right.
the reality is yeah, we're going to allow reproductive choice. So if there's a survivor who wants to come to Maryland, who is pregnant and doesn't want to be pregnant, or does want to be pregnant,
Mhm.
they can come here and they can seek the care that they need and that they want, and then go back to their home state. And the people that help facilitate that in Maryland, the providers that are working with them, are not going to then be subject to prosecution or civil penalties from the whatever state it is it's trying to reach into Maryland. And so that's the perfect example of sort of the unintended consequences. What it's actually doing is harming that survivor and making it impossible, if this didn't pass, for them to then come to Maryland and seek the care that they want and they need.
Right. And then I think the thing that made me the angriest, which is my anger was kind of the impetus behind this webinar, was that I saw legislators that have historically fought us tooth and nail on any progress toward making survivors whole, suddenly very interested in the welfare of survivors of trafficking and saying, we care about survivors of trafficking in this state, and therefore we shouldn't allow this law to go into place into effect if there is a chance that this is going to harm survivors. And what people like us were saying is, again, the coercion is the crime, right? If you coerce someone or you force someone into getting healthcare that they don't want, that is criminal. Criminalizing the actual or disallowing the actual healthcare for those, especially when there's a spectrum of need, a lot of which is legitimate, and folks do not want to be tethered to their perpetrators for the rest of their lives, that the solution is not to limit access to that, especially in the context of saying that we actually care about trafficking survivors. And this has kind of gone on to be legislation that's passed in other states. In Idaho, they actually expanded the legal definition of trafficking to include transporting minors across state lines for reproductive health care. And they termed this new crime abortion trafficking, to make people think that they're preventing trafficking, when in reality they're criminalizing care for that for many survivors can help free them from the context of their abuse rather than the other way around. And I use this as an example. The issue we're highlighting today is not everyone has to be pro-abortion, right? The issue of what to do with an unplanned or a medically dangerous pregnancy, or, in more relevantly, a pregnancy that happens by way of sexual violence, as is commonly the case with sex trafficking, is deeply, deeply personal. It's often rooted in people's faith. What we are addressing today is the use of and the exploitation of the trafficking narrative to pass bills that are in many cases dangerous for trafficking survivors, that take away their choices, and that which actually result in putting them at greater risk of exploitation in the case of these laws by trapping them in poverty, by tethering them to their abusers because they share a child in common. Like I said, where there is coercion by a trafficker in their victim's choice to have an abortion, that's the crime, not the abortion itself. And so we need to be very deliberate when we're dealing with issues that rightfully evoke, like you said, Melanie, such passionate responses, whether or not the thing we seek to address is actually being made worse or more possible for others because of a piece of legislation. Melanie, anything left to add on that?
I just, I think as we're talking about this, I don't know the backgrounds of everybody that's on this call, but there are things you can do and get involved in and following legislation, through the Human Trafficking Task Force in Maryland, by following Human Trafficking Prevention Project and Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. We put out information about legislation and calls for action and reaching out to legislators. And so I don't expect people on this call, unless they're in the policy world, to necessarily be aware, but to follow the people who do monitor this stuff. And when there is a call for action, to lend your voice because of the harmful nature of some of what's being done. And so I just, I always like to, and what do we do about this? Because it's going to continue to come up again and again and again. And so we read every trafficking bill, we read every domestic violence bill, and it's really with that eye of what are we really trying to do here? Because there is that risk that, you read that title of that first bill and you're like, oh, this is awesome. What are we going to do? And then you have to really take that deep dive and say, but, and talk to people who work directly with victims and survivors, who are the victims and survivors themselves, and how would this impact you? And what would this mean to you? And what would this help you? Would this create some unintended consequence for you? So, so there is opportunity if you want to get more involved in this part of the work, which is, a sort of a different lane. But as we're discussing it, I think it's important to always tell people how they can connect if they're interested.
Yeah. All right. So we are going to transition from talking about trafficking and abortion to talking about trafficking and immigration. Now, Lauren, to kind of start you off, there's a lot of kind of similarities around the link between trafficking and immigration that a lot of similarities with the movement's creation, like the use of state and federal law enforcement to, quote, save victims from the untoward men who seek to harm them. And then actually also that the anti-trafficking narratives that are created and perpetuated here in the United States have had global consequences, right? Particularly with regard to migration. And in particular, a wave of rather restrictive and punitive migration policies have emerged around the globe in the name of helping trafficking victims. And there's a quote that I want to read by the Global Alliance Against Trafficking of Women that just kind of sets the stage, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. So when announcing that victims of trafficking have been rescued, governments have taken advantage of the term trafficking to imply that the individuals concerned have been brought to the country concerned against their wishes and consequently have no wish and no right to remain there. By using the word trafficking, governmental officials claim that they are rescuing and helping trafficked persons, while in fact they take no notice of their wishes and forcibly repatriate them. So let's kind of use that, the history that we've already talked about in this history to set the stage for what we're seeing in U.S. politics, which is the use of the issue of trafficking, particularly child trafficking, as the impetus to close the U.S. border. And again, the wisdom policy-wise of closing the border is one that should most certainly be debated. What we are discussing today is the use and exploitation of the trafficking narrative to effectuate change that actually makes people more vulnerable to being exploited. So considering this history, let's turn it over to Lauren to get us started on this portion of the discussion. Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So, as you kind of introduced, what we're seeing in debates about immigration and border policy, and what we're seeing to support strict and punitive immigration policies is this reliance on the perpetuation of like fear and threats of security, including, right, the trafficking of children across borders, relying on the perpetuation of fear and threats of security based on, at its core, myths about human trafficking, just very well understood myths, but that are sort of relied upon to perpetuate some really harmful policies. So I first want to address just a couple of these myths and kind of introduce those to think about in the context of human trafficking or anti-human trafficking as sort of a basis for strict immigration policies. And also thinking about sort of how human trafficking really is not an immigration issue. It's really the exploitation of labor that escalates beyond sort of mistreatment into another level when you have those elements of force, fraud, and coercion. And those do target vulnerable populations like immigrant and migrant communities, but human trafficking is not an immigration issue, per se. So I want to talk about those myths and address some of those, and then talk about how immigration labor policies, as we're each discussing, are actually exacerbating exploitative working conditions and the risk of human trafficking. So these myths, they're well understood in the community, hopefully, and are coined really well by the Polaris Project. So if you want to see their summary of these myths, you can find them on their website. But I wanted to talk about a couple in particular. So the first myth is that only undocumented foreign nationals get trafficked in the United States, that this is only an issue that survivors, victims of human trafficking across our borders are vulnerable, undocumented folks or undocumented folks within the United States. And this is just not true. We know that survivors of trafficking are U.S. citizens. There are specific risk factors related to trafficking, like recent migration or relocation, and then plenty of other issues like substance abuse, mental health concerns, involvement with the child welfare system, being homeless youth, things like that. So it's not at its core about non-citizens, undocumented folks, although that's where a lot of research and attention goes, and rightfully so, because it certainly does impact the undocumented folks. But that sort of pigeonholes us into thinking about human trafficking as only affecting those communities, and really not understanding human trafficking as the concept that it is, which is, as it's coined a lot of times, modern day slavery, right? It's forced labor, whether that's sex or other, labor trafficking. The next myth is that human trafficking only happens in illegal or underground industries. So again, rather than thinking about human trafficking as folks sort of avoiding the legal system and criminal activity, where we see it most is in sort of set up industries in our country. So for domestic workers, migrant workers in agriculture, restaurants, hotels, factories, and then of course in forced sex work. So rethinking again, sort of where we're seeing human trafficking, what that actually looks like. And as a component of this, and I'll get back to this later, the industries where human trafficking happens, they're industries that we all participate in all the time, as opposed to it being sort of this, again, underground criminal activity, which certainly that can happen, that does happen. But most trafficking is within industries that sort of are kind of moving and rolling all the time throughout our country and our day-to-day lives. So, traffickers include individuals, business owners, can include members of a gang or network, also can include parents or family members, intimate partners, as we were just talking about, owners of farms or restaurants, and then powerful, corporate executives or government representatives. So thinking again about kind of what is the system and who are the stakeholders, and really understanding it's more about a forced labor system, not about a moving people system, which brings me to my next myth, which is that human trafficking involves moving, traveling, or transporting a person across state or national borders. So, folks on this call are in the human trafficking world, the anti-trafficking, community. So you all understand that the core definition of trafficking is about force, fraud, and coercion, and about forcing somebody to do commercial sex work or forcing somebody to do labor that is unpaid. Different, we have state statutes that define it. We have our federal statute that defines it, but it's really about control tactics like physical and emotional abuse, threats, isolation from friends, family, economic abuse, all these factors to, push somebody into the situation of forced work, whatever that type of work is. It's not about moving somebody from one place to another. And I think the word trafficking is what's so confusing about that, right? And it can really lead to a misunderstanding of, what we're talking about, the issue we're talking about when we're talking about human trafficking. And sort of in this vein is also the issue of seeing sort of the trafficker as the smuggler, or the person perpetuating illegal entries, like right within the context of immigration, which it kind of falls from what we were talking about in terms of sort of like who we want to protect from who is, the perpetrator. And so in the context of immigration, where, it's not a component of human trafficking that somebody crosses state or national borders, but that does happen. Like, folks are survivors of trafficking who are defrauded into coming to the United States to work, right? Things like that. So that happens, or coerced by an intimate partner to come to the US for commercial sex work, right? So these things do happen across the border, but it's not, that component of it isn't what is the trafficking, right? So, and along kind of the lines of like, what is sort of who are we trying to protect with anti-trafficking, policies, and where this come from? You sort of also have the idea of the perfect victim. And in the context of immigration, this is really difficult, right? A lot of the focus in anti-human trafficking is on prosecution. Prosecution needs a witness. The witness is going to be the survivor, right? But we want a survivor who is, somebody that we can put up and will tell their whole story, and they were, forced in a way that we can understand, and, held against their will, and, all of these ideas about what that victim will be able to do, that survivor, and tell their whole story and disclose it. And then they'll be able to sort of shift, that person is not a criminal issue, it's the trafficker. So the things that come up for somebody who is, an immigrant or a migrant and facing this situation, is that you're really at the whim of law enforcement. I mean, for any survivor who's reporting to law enforcement, if you're in an industry where it's not regulated, or you're sort of outside of what is the part of the industry that's regulated, maybe you're facing criminal consequences. And so, that's really scary to be confronting law enforcement to do that. In terms of immigration, you're also facing immigration consequences. So if you don't have status, or you have fallen out of status, or, whatever the case might be, That's another potential risk. You could go and report to law enforcement as a witness and be deported. I mean, there's like that happens. We've seen it happen. You have things like continuous presence, which is something that's a sort of discretionary protection against deportation and provides for work authorization. It's temporary, and it is basically to allow for a survivor to remain in the United States to be a witness in the prosecution. It's supposed to be really straightforward, and it is just used to tie people's hands to drag them along through the process of reporting many times, right? Not to be too, not to emphasize it too much, but it happens. And it's intended to be a really straightforward policy, but and it's a really great idea, and it's really critical. Again, we talk about ways that folks can get out of the trafficking situation, can move on from the trafficking situation, and for folks who are undocumented, which again, that's not all, but if we're talking about the immigration context, like having authorization to work, that's a huge part of it. Or not being afraid of deportation and being able to confront an employer's threats about deportation, that's a huge part of it. So, so those are kind of some of the myths that I think really are latched onto within the sort of immigration policy debate. And there's just a huge disconnect between really what human trafficking is, what the issues are, what kinds of policies will protect folks against trafficking, and kind of how it's being used.
So I'm noticing in all of the things that you say are helpful, there's also a question about deficits regarding work authorization and immigrant relief options, such as the T visa. None of those things are solved by shutting down the border.
Right. Right. I mean, and so, what we see are so we've talked about myths and how those are used to perpetuate things, but then we have these policies in immigration, but also in sort of a labor context that are exacerbating the risk for human trafficking. And it's sort of twofold. And I think that the obvious one is strict and punitive immigration policies that kind of force people to be in the country and undocumented. It's pretty straightforward, right? And we have policies like bans on asylum seekers or bars to reentry for folks who attempt to enter without, authorization to enter the country, bars for 3 years, 10 years, permanent bars that cut off their pathways permanently to status. And then even things like extreme delays in processing folks who should be eligible, right? The T visa process is longer and longer. The U visa process is extremely long. And so it's someone who we've created, this pathway to immigration relief based on cooperation with law enforcement. Okay. But it takes a decade to get anywhere with it. And in the meantime that you're waiting, you don't have status, you don't have work authorization, and you're waiting 6+ years at this point. I mean, 6 years from the time that you're filing, and you're eligible for this relief. It's wild. And in that time you remain vulnerable, super vulnerable to human trafficking and then and other types of exploitation. Obviously for undocumented folks, it's just so much harder to access workers' rights. So even if we get back to human trafficking within that labor context, like if you're undocumented, a lot of workers' rights apply to you, but it's just so difficult to access those, to access resources, to, be willing to risk your exploitative work, which might just be the only work you have and that you rely on. What I think is a lot more interesting is sort of the immigration systems that we have that are sort of almost codifying and perpetuating exploitation. It's just inherent in the system that we've created. And the best example, and the one that I have the most experience with, is these, guest worker visa programs. So when we're talking about migrant farm workers, H-2A workers, there are just some really key factors that make obvious how at risk these folks are. So we're talking about folks who are from abroad, who come to the United States through a legal pathway to work on a temporary basis. They are here because a U.S. employer has said, I can't find anybody to do this job. And U.S. government, I want to bring somebody in from abroad to work for me because I can't find local workers. The government, Department of State says, okay. And then they apply for a visa for folks that they have recruited from abroad. Okay, so when they're doing that recruiting, they explain the terms of what this job will be. And what is super common in labor trafficking of migrant workers is fraud in the terms of that contract. So sort of there are all these things that are supposed to happen about housing, about breaks for the bathroom, about water, about food, and about your mobility, your pay, that and sort of whether or not you can charge fees, which you cannot charge recruiting fees, but that are happening anyway. And so there's fraud in the system that then once people are in the United States, leads them to being at risk or potentially, you know, in a trafficking situation. And so a lot of the qualities are, you know, with this H-2A visa too, one of the inherent components of it as it is right now is that it is tied to a specific employer. So where normally a worker can say, you know what, this mistreatment, I don't want to subject myself to it, so I'm going to leave this employer and find new employment. The H-2A visa doesn't allow that for the worker. If they leave their employer, they become out of status in the United States. So they just don't have that option. So you are sort of at the whim of your employer, and if you want to work and if you want that job, and if you don't want to fall out of status and you're trying to work within sort of the system that we have, you're stuck with that employer. And that employer is in charge of your food, your transportation, your housing, your work, everything as you migrate to, you know, whatever job you're doing while you're here. You know, again, with that migration, you're isolated. So we're thinking about farm workers. You're in a field, you are out of sight, you're out of public mind, and it's super easy to exploit. And then you're also, you know, not able to access the resources that otherwise might help to protect somebody who's facing mistreatment at work. So lack of access to legal resources, lack of access to health resources, lack of access to a grocery store. I mean, just like the whole spectrum. Language barriers also an issue. And then there are ways in which the system is allowing sort of even greater exploitation. So a really good example is in a really classic H-2A visa, you're seeing the employer bringing a worker to say, come work on my farm. This is the work that you will do. You will do this agricultural work, which, you know, by the way, you don't get the protections that you normally would as a worker, generally all kinds of exemptions from regular labor protections. And then, you know, I'll pay you and then you'll go back. Well, what's happening is actually there's one company that's doing the come to the United States, and then they're contracting out these workers to growers that then are kind of disconnected from who the H-2A employer is. And so you're just seeing, it just becomes a much more difficult system to enforce, you know, the proper labor standards that are supposed to be there, the safety measures that are there. It's a lot harder to find people, to track people, and harder to hold them accountable as, you know, the work gets contracted out. I just think that's such a good example of seeing how we have sort of like, that's our codified, that is our system, and it is sort of like built to exploit people.
So it sounds, so we're getting up towards 1 o'clock, and we have got half an hour left, and I still want to get to CP. But what I'm hearing you say is that, and I'm not sure if this is actually the right terminology for this, and I apologize. Hopefully you'll know what I mean. The border, the need to close down the border is kind of like the straw man that looks like a solution, whereas the broken immigration system in and of itself, in all the ways that you just described, that's what perpetuates these paths towards exploitation. Am I hearing that correctly? And that actually the harsher policies, like just close down the border and don't let anyone in, that is something that in and of itself can perpetuate those pathways towards exploitation.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other thing that I hear about, there's actually there was an article an opinion article that said the odd new claim about Biden and child slavery is very revealing. And it talked about, worries about unaccompanied minors. Obviously, the harrowing experience that they have, the trauma that they suffer. And, essentially what it says was the problem is that unaccompanied kids are allowed in to begin with. Admitting them and settling them into more humane situations isn't a solution. Solving the child labor problem must inherently entail shutting migration down, right? And so again, there's that straw man around, wanting an easy solution to this. When you mentioned probably 10 different things, and a couple of folks that obviously know immigration were kind of chiming in on the question and answer that said that the systems that are in place now that there are chronically failing attempts to fix, that those things would be far more effective in preventing exploitation rather than shutting down the border.
Right. And I think along those lines, like a great example is, the New York Times did a couple of great articles on the child labor that is being used of newly arrived folks by companies and businesses across the country, how pervasive it is, and even states that are rolling back child labor law protections to accommodate for this work, right? So it's a total disconnect. Yeah.
Can you just say a little bit more about those types of laws, those rollback? Because I think that's something that not a lot of people are aware of. So we care about the plight of unaccompanied minors and them being trafficked, yet
right. I mean, they're creating sort of a system that will allow for it to be lawful, because that's what sort of folks who are lobbying and empower and business owners, some business owners are looking for, is a kind of this type of labor, which is going to, be available and cheaper, and, a type of labor that they can exploit. And so sort of like protections like, the age limits for work, the hours for work, those kinds of measures that, would normally protect a child and now are going to create, again, sort of a the path for them to be in this environment, this exploitative work environment, to then, be subjected to more labor violations, which can lead to trafficking.
So again, another way, go ahead, CP, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you.
So I don't want to get into, I don't want to get into the question of like what type of like visa is more moral than any others, but I do think that we see a lot of this harm specifically in the asylum context, where you have, especially like queer youth, youth from like minority groups, etc., like trying to escape overt horrific violence and systemic issues, like coming to the US border and seeking asylum and being told you can't come in.
Mm-hmm.
And their alternative is frequently either going back to where they were, like their life was threatened in the first place, or turning to like informal trafficking in order to escape like the harm. And because we've created a system that penalizes people who are trying to take advantage or who are trying to use the asylum process, we've made it more likely for those people to be harmed through trafficking than if we just allowed them to come in as asylum seekers.
So another thing that folks can think about, to what Melanie was saying, another thing that folks can think about getting involved in is these type of pre-existing immigration problems before we create another one by shutting down the border, and getting involved with organizations that want to make people's livelihoods more possible and less restrictive and less criminalized and all of those things. That is a method of anti-trafficking prevention, right, Melanie? She's like, okay. All right. So we're going to turn.
Yes. I mean,
yes.
It is a yes. I mean, it's all of those things.
Right. I was kind of bringing in some of the question and answers that were specific to immigration as we were going. So I am going to introduce kind of our last topic for the last 25 minutes of our webinar. And that is how trafficking or the exploitation and abuse of children is being used to limit the rights of trans people in this country to obtain medical care and essentially to exist. There's far less kind of direct link, I should say, with the anti-trafficking movement and history here, like there is with immigration. But the link between trans folks and trafficking is relatively straightforward, although this is not prioritized by very many organizations that are doing anti-trafficking works. And that is that efforts at raising public awareness about the crime of human trafficking commonly ignore the impact that gender identity and gender presentation have on a person's vulnerability to trafficking. And the reality is that non-binary, transgender, gender nonconforming people are put at disproportionately higher risk of being trafficked because of the discrimination and isolation they so commonly face, which very understandably translates into those hallmarks of heightened trafficking risk, like interpersonal violence, like financial instability, like homelessness, like drug use. And one of the most common forms of discrimination that trans folks face is lack of access to gender affirming healthcare. And lacking access to gender affirming care can be incredibly now, actually, let me back up. Not every trans person wants to access gender affirming care, but for those that do, lacking access to gender affirming care can be incredibly dangerous for those folks. It impacts their access to housing, to mainstream employment, to education, as well as simply their freedom to safely navigate social spaces. And experiences like that typically drive affected individuals further into isolation, which is why the trans population is put at such exceptionally high risk of exploitation. But what we know now, and what I'm going to lead in with you, is that as the transgender community as a whole and the need for trans people to access gender affirming care has gained greater visibility, greater traction, those who seek to limit or deny this access to trans people have in many cases started using the narrative of child abuse and exploitation as their reason for doing so. And that's kind of where this piece came in. So I'm going to turn it over to CP to continue this discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, so we are, as Jess said, very much in the early days of this sort of discourse. Basically, if you look at the history of like trans rights in the United States, we had a moment a few years ago where people suddenly were like, oh, maybe it isn't the worst thing ever if someone is trans. And we started to have sort of laws, social policies, etc., that made it easier to exist as a trans person in the world, or in the country. And now we're seeing the backlash to that. And especially over the past couple of years, we've seen a real sustained attack on trans people in like across the country, but especially in conservatively controlled states. There are currently 20 states that have prohibitions on accessing transition-related care for minors, and that would be like age-appropriate transition-related care. So, if we're talking prepubescence, that's like seeing a therapist. If we're talking about, like someone who's in their teens, that's like going on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. We're not talking about like we're gonna do the surgery to a 9-year-old or something, because first off, there's not the surgery, and second, like that's not age appropriate for a 9-year-old. That's largely things for adults. But the reality of this is kind of completely divorced from the political rhetoric that we're hearing, which is framed so much on the like trans people as like weird sexual deviants, and how we're trying to pervert children to, we're trying to groom children to become, like us, so that we'll have a next generation of people to, destroy their lives or whatever. Usually they're not quite that overt with the rhetoric, at least in legislative places, but if you go on social media, they are that overt, and it's really quite horrifying. Now, how this ties into trafficking, and I needed to get a little bit through some of the background to really explain how it ties into trafficking. We're seeing, just as in the abortion context, laws restricting the ability to travel out of state to receive care for reproductive health. We're also seeing significant restrictions on the ability to receive care for transition-related purposes, or to sometimes travel outside of the state to do the same thing. And in fact, if we're talking about, a trans person who is seeking ongoing care, it's going to be a situation where they're going to be having to cross that border all the time. If we're talking about abortion, frequently you're crossing the state line, seeing the abortion provider, and then going back and you're done. Or more or less done. Maybe you have to take your like mifepristone when you get back, but like you're basically done, and it's like a one-time thing. But for like trans people, we have like medications that we're on, for some of us, for all of our lives. And so, if we're talking about like a trans teen with parents who are affirming and are like, I recognize that this is who my child really is, and they're having to cross the border from, say, West Virginia to Maryland, like, every few months to see a doctor, to get prescriptions filled, etc. And they have to keep going back to West Virginia because that's where they live. Then it's really important, first, how Maryland treats requests for information from West Virginia, and also how West Virginia treats care accessed outside of it. And so you have this real risk that affirming parents who are, taking their kids to get healthcare that they need, that's age appropriate, that's endorsed by, dozens of medical associations, including the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, et cetera, that have said this is what's appropriate. There's the real risk that these parents will be portrayed as traffickers, and that their affirming, loving conduct will be criminalized as trafficking. And we're already seeing states trying to criminalize that movement out of state, including sometimes just literally moving out of state. There's, a few places that have tried to say, oh, if you just try to leave the state to access this, then that's a violation of our state law.
Which, and just to point out, like, people are calling it an issue of trafficking, but it has nothing to do with trafficking. It's crossing state lines and laws that are state laws passed to say, we won't allow this conduct, but it has nothing to do with trafficking. It's not the right use of the word trafficking. This is not human trafficking, right? But it is again latching on to this myth about trafficking is shuttling children across borders to sort of, again, perpetuate fear in this context. But it's not a trafficking issue. It is state laws that are criminalizing that action, but that action of taking a child across it's not trafficking. So it's just another example of just latching on to these myths.
And so perpetuating the misinformation, and also kind of exploiting parents' very real care and fear about their children. I mean, when you talk about kids, that's going to get my attention, and that's going to get a parent's attention, as it should. And so the exploitation of that narrative to pass laws or policies that very insidiously are designed to discriminate against people, or that which, kind of perpetuate systems and experiences that put people at higher risk for exploitation, That's the real danger of these kinds of messages. And they're framed, like you said, as trafficking or as parents' rights.
Mm-hmm.
Right, CP?
Yeah, and you honestly don't even have to get to the point of criminalizing cross-border movement to see how these things can really encourage trafficking or encourage people to be put into situations where they're likely to be trafficked. And an example of that is, say you have a kid in Texas who, you know, has supportive parents who are like, we love you, we understand that you're trans, but it's just not, we just aren't able because of state law to, you know, get you care. Now, or money, or, you know, they don't have money to move, they have family there, there's a you know, hundreds of situations that people aren't, you know, just able to drop everything and move to, you know, California or Maryland or Illinois or wherever. So, but that trans teen, they're still a trans teen, and they're still going through the literal body horror of seeing, like, of puberty, which is just like already body horror, like, as we can all attest, but it's even more body horror when you're seeing your body change in ways that you just are the antithesis of what you like, what you want and what you feel is appropriate on the inside. And you know that there's medical options available that your state is just saying no. And so for a lot of people, despite the fact that they would otherwise have like loving, supportive family situations, they're pushed into feeling like, I need to get out of here in order to access this care. Because if I don't, then, you know, if we're talking about like transmasculine people, they're like, you know, they're like, I'm going to be growing like boobs that I don't want. Or, you know, trans feminine people, like, you know, will hear their voices change and things. And it's like all these things that like just create such massive dysphoria in trans teens. And, you know, it really does push people to like leave supportive families in order to access care. And that once they're outside of that supportive environment, they're far more likely to like become at risk of actual trafficking.
Right. And I know Lauren said, and she's right, that not every trafficking experience occurs kind of underneath the radar, but people who are forced to exist underneath the radar, that is where exploiters are going to hide. And so young folks who are obtaining hormones off the street, or who are trading sex for their survival because they can't get mainstream employment because they look trans, right? And that is where those folks are going to be. So Lauren's right, but also when you do drive people into the underground, that unfortunately is where those folks are hanging out.
And I mean, CP, what you're describing is you have the supportive family. You have you have parents who are doing what parents should do and accepting and supporting their child in who they are and who they want to be. And then because of some of these policies and because of some of the rhetoric and how things are manipulated, it's actually placing a child that is being supported. There's so many children that aren't, but it's basically taking the families that are doing things the right way and are being supportive and placing that child in a harm that and even a separation from their family just so that they can seek the care that they need. It's just, and it's mind-blowing sometimes.
You see this probably most frequently in custody situations where you know, the one supportive parent is like trying to take the kid out of state or something, and then the non-supportive parent gets like a court order barring that. Or you know, there was a case recently where someone had taken their kid to Colorado and then had gotten an order from Texas that they had to take the kid back to Texas and give full custody to like the non-supportive parent. And like that is a recipe for disaster in so many ways.
So right, that you're creating that's someone who is going to just look for then their own survival, is going to be in a really vulnerable, really desperate position, which is sort of what we're talking about. and is going to be at risk for all different kinds of trafficking, including the sort of, under the radar, or if you're talking about sex work, but also other kinds too, if you're trying to find work and maybe it's an awful work situation, but that was the job you got and you're a kid and you're super desperate and like you're going to take what you can get. And even if it's abusive, exploitative, and then you're in a position where it can turn into something even worse, and turn into human trafficking. So it's, I mean, it's just kind of like leads to these pathways, and it's certainly
messy web.
Yeah, and being an unsupported youth who like is unhoused or is then maybe susceptible to other issues or is now not supported by their parents, so now they're probably experiencing some difficult mental health issues. Like, it can be all kinds of different things that then like is just putting them more and more and more at risk. And so I think the community and like this issue that CP is talking about, it just has so many of those risk factors that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Now, we also see many, many other aspects of like trans existence that and just hit on this briefly at the beginning, that sort of make trans people more likely to fall into situations where we're apt to be susceptible to trafficking in the real sense. And, I could talk a great while about like employment discrimination and housing discrimination and all of that. Because of the other topics that we were talking about, it made sense to talk about the healthcare situation. But I do want to emphasize that's not the only way that like trans people are put at risk.
Right. But what we're focusing on today is the use of the exploitation and abuse narrative to limit particularly access to gender affirming care and limit the rights of young folks and their potentially supportive parents to simply exist as trans youth.
Exactly.
And it is, again, I keep wanting to use that word insidious. It is particularly insidious to see folks who are, essentially exploiting this narrative in order to cause discriminatory harm to trans folks. And as an anti-trafficking movement, we should care so much about how our work and the experiences of our clients are being used to cause harm, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that I want to highlight. And I was hoping Melanie could just talk a little bit about how folks can get involved in, anti-trafficking prevention work. And then I know Carrie has a final question for all of us.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the best way to get involved, especially because I know many of the people on here probably are doing direct services. So, I can't talk and type so much at the same time, but I would suggest following certain organizations. So there's the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. There's the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Make sure you're signed up for the newsletters that the Human Trafficking Prevention Project sends out. I don't know.
We'll put all this information in the one pager for this. So just keep talking.
Perfect. So CP and Lauren, certainly you might have other resources as well. I would educate yourselves on the legislative process in Maryland and familiarize yourself with who your senators and delegates are and make sure that they understand your position, especially if you're in one of the jurisdictions that some of the great ideas come from. That is sarcastic, but and informing them and educating, I think that explaining exactly. I think explaining all of these, I think some people just don't understand. And so they actually do think that this is well-intentioned. And so they just actually don't understand what the unintended consequences are. But it's far more impactful if legislators hear from constituents and from people who are doing the direct work in their communities and hear exactly how it would have that impact on them if they have lived experience or the people that they're working with, to understand what that impact would be and what that would actually look like. So those are some of the ways that I would suggest, is making yourself aware and then taking an action, because during the legislative session, which starts the second Wednesday in January and runs for 90 days. You'll see action alerts on social media. You'll get, if you're signed up for newsletters, you'll get an email blast about certain issues, if calls need to be made, and take that action. A lot of it is really at most a copy and paste of an email. You know, if you want, set up a meeting with, you know, with your legislator and go down to Annapolis in person, or they'll do it over Zoom, or even testify on a bill. So those are all sorts of different ways and varying ways to get involved. But I think the first part is just making sure that you're even aware of what's going on, because I would imagine for many of you, you didn't even know that these kinds of bills were being introduced and discussed. And that's why we're doing this webinar, so that people are understanding what the narrative is in certain circumstances and how we can counter that narrative.
So that's actually a perfect segue for the question that I wanted to ask. I'm going to, just for lack of time, I'm going to focus on asking CP and Lauren. But just really quickly, how do you think that we can hold those in the anti-trafficking field specifically accountable for perpetuating these myths that we've talked about, or for playing into these myths? What do you think we can do as a group to hold anti-trafficking people responsible?
So one thing that I think is crucial is that folks in this work, and that's honestly not me, I'm in adjacent work, but I think it's crucial that folks in this work make sure that their voices are heard, and that the people who are crying the trafficking wolf for everything under the sun are not representative of what the issue really is. And it's so easy if you look at, you know, sort of right-wing social media, movies that made lots of money over the summer, et cetera, to see like this false narrative of trafficking. And so insofar as you, as the people on the ground doing this work, can say that isn't actually the issue, the problem is this other thing, and you can pull back the issue of trafficking from like the people who are misusing it, that's honestly probably the best thing that you can do in this regard.
And I would just add along those lines, I mean, it's just having a really good, clear understanding of what the myths are around human trafficking, and empowering yourself as an advocate and in your community to be sort of fluent in the language of dispelling those myths, so that if on the face something is called an anti-trafficking, you know, measure, protective measure, you have those myths at hand, and you can say, well, that's not true of human trafficking, so what's the real reason behind this? And you can really challenge things on the face and take the discussion to the next step, and think about things in sort of that broader context, like, oh, we want to close the borders because we don't want people here, but we're trying to get people here to do this labor, but what we want is for them to be within a system that we can exploit them. So just being armed with understanding those myths in order to challenge them when they come up, which is what CP just said, so I'm not even saying anything new. But
well, we want to thank all of our panelists. This was an amazing discussion. Thank you, Lauren, CP, and Melanie, for joining us today. Really quick, we're right on the border of our time limit. So we do have a survey at the end. We value your feedback. Please, please make sure you fill out that survey. Additionally, as Jess mentioned a couple times, we will be sending out a one-pager to give kind of a snapshot of what we've been going over today, so don't panic. Additionally, this webinar will be available on our website. If you need to make, or if you'd like to make a referral to the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, please see our website. It's htprevention.org. And and also the CP said to mention to them that outlaid.
Sorry. I can, sorry.
Out
My
loud.
dog was going crazy because the postal worker just came to the door and she was like, I will murder you. But she's calmed down now. I just wanted to make sure that people, especially in the Baltimore area, are aware of Baltimore Safe Haven, which does a lot of fabulous, like on the ground work with trans people. who are at risk of being trafficked. So if you have a trans client that's come to you and is looking for resources, make sure you refer them to Baltimore Safe Haven. Even if they're not in Baltimore, Baltimore Safe Haven frequently will know who to send them to.
Also, if you would like any more information about the HTPP, please see our website. Thank you, everybody. And Jess, did you want to say any closing comments, or
I do not.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.